Okay, I'd like to begin by asking you to state your name, when and where you were born, and a little bit about your parents.
My name is John Thomas Bruce. My friends call me Jack, which is what I prefer. My parents, John Bruce Jr. and Jean Knowles Bruce, are my parents. I was born in Norfolk in March of 1951, March 6th, Norfolk General Hospital, and then lived in Norfolk until I went away to Wave and Mary. Enjoyed living in Norfolk. If anybody ever had a better childhood than mine, I'd like to talk to them, because my mother's extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all lived within rock throwing distance of one another, and my grandparents lived on the Lafayette River. As a consequence, any family things that we did together, there were, well, let's see, 10 cousins and 8 adults to supervise us, so we made a pretty good party. And the river, of course, afforded time for sailboating, fishing, crabbing with a hand line. I recommend that to anyone who needs to develop patience. And my overgenerous grandparents gave me quite a lot. And the thing that they gave me most was their time. It's great to be with grandparents because they don't have a dog in the fight. I could just grow up, whereas my parents wanted me to grow up in a certain way. As a consequence, I got the best of both worlds. I got to play in the neighborhood, Larimore Lawns, sandlot football, sandlot baseball, and went to the elementary school that had just been built for that neighborhood. We were among the first people who moved in. It was so new, the teachers were writing on the concrete blocks because the chalkboards hadn't come in. I was a very good student in elementary school, and I got to narrate all the plays, and if there was some place to go that they needed somebody presentable, such as planting a tree from our sister city in Japan in Norfolk's azalea garden, I got the call. And Norfolk was just a great place to grow up then. In that area, there were lots of kids. We had a lot of fun. And since we were not very mobile, being pretty much stuck on our bicycles or feet, we didn't get much trouble. And so then I went to Azalea Gardens Junior High School and Norview High School for a year, then transferred to Lake Taylor High School when it was first built, and had the benefit of being the seniors for 2 years. They didn't allow seniors from other high schools to transfer. Now, all this time, I was trying to do the best I could academically, because that was important to my parents. My father had earned a football scholarship to William and Mary. He was a wonderful athlete, one of the most graceful people I have ever seen. And he tried out for the pros 1 year, but that was in New York, and my grandmother wasn't having any of that. So came back, went to work for my grandfather, married my mother, and we just had a real good time, an extended family. We went to church together, we picnicked together, we went all kinds of places and did all sorts of things, the 20 of us. But it was in the boats that they gave me the biggest, second biggest gift. I had to learn how to row a 10-ton rowboat before I could get a motorboat, but eventually I moved up in class. And the nicest thing about that was that my grandmother did not work outside the home. She worked plenty inside, but she had time to talk to me. And it was fabulous, because although I seem to have run on rather a lot, when I was 6, I could keep my mouth shut. And I learned a lot from her. And so I have acquired memories of what it was like for her growing up in the country outside of Gordonsville, long about 1900. And I marvel at her life. She grew up in a house with neither insulation, electricity, or running water, and lived to see the moon rocket and so many other things. Quite astonishing.
Well, now that raises some questions for me, and that is your grandmother, and is this your paternal or your maternal?
Maternal.
Your maternal grandmother. How did your grandparents meet?
Stonewall Jackson Grammar School. They had both gone to that school. My grandfather only stayed through the 8th grade because his family was in necessitous circumstances, and he took several jobs involving delivering special delivery letters and telegrams. And my grandmother stayed in Stonewall Jackson a little longer, then went to work for the phone company, which was then connected with Western Union, and she was a typist. So she would type out telegrams and telephone messages. And they've never explained to me, and I don't blame them, exactly how they got together, but believe me, if any two people were ever crazy about each other, it was the two of them. And I mean, they stayed together till the last breath.
So were they also living in Norfolk?
Yes, they lived on the Lafayette River. My grandfather practiced accounting and had an office downtown. And my grandmother, once she got married, was told by my grandfather, no more working outside the house. So she became the housewife driven by the Thursday hair appointment, the Wednesday trip to the grocery store, and then the tending to me. I was the first grandchild and the only one for more than a year, and you'd have thought I was the little prince. My mother was a very intelligent woman. She no sooner got set up in our first house than she started writing a column for the newspaper where she had worked while in high school, and then started her own advertising agency in our utility room. And my sister and I would go with her to meet with clients. Most of the time we were not decoration, we were just told to sit somewhere and to be quiet. But her agency grew very well, and soon she had an office and a graphic artist, another person to write copy. She did TV ads, radio ads, and print ads, and did really, really well.
What was the name of her agency?
Well, the agency eventually became known as Bruce, Redmond, and Matthias. Mama, of course, and her brother-in-law, Russ Redmond, who had married her baby sister, Carolyn. She was wild about Carolyn, and they did the most fun things. They liked to go to New Orleans together, and she told me about going to Cape Paul's, where it's just, you sit where you sit. And here were these two gray-haired ladies, not exactly young, and two very large young football players from LSU just sat at the table with them, and she said they had a grand time. Of course, Mama usually had a grand time wherever she went. She was a very happy person. She is a very happy person at 86. She's very busy. And she translated that into an interest in all things that produce civic good. And I think she's proudest of the fact that for many years, she was the director of the Tidewater Planning Council, which covered areas like Norfolk, Portsmouth, Hampton, Newport News, Virginia Beach, Chesapeake. And the object was to apply for and hopefully be given grants, mostly from the federal government, but often from the state, to do all kinds of do-gooder stuff. That's what I used to call it, because I thought she was a real do-gooder. But it was a quite intense job, and she wound up supervising a large number of people. She was director for 20 years. When I look at the good that she got done, it is really quite amazing. It was unusual for women to be in business at the time when she was, which had been 1952 to 1955 with the advertising agency. But she never met a person she didn't like, and most people liked her, even if they didn't like her opinion. And I can prove that to you with the Norfolk School Board, of which she was a member for 8 years, during the time when Norfolk was trying to undo busing so that children didn't have to drive 45 minutes to another school for the purpose of integrating it. And so they tried to recraft school districts to eliminate that, but preserve the diversity of student populations. Went to the Supreme Court twice, and Henry Marsh cross-examined her for 3 hours, and Mama didn't think much of it, but I don't believe he got very far, much as I like Mr. Marsh. And so that was a lot to go and do, but she's always had a happy attitude. She never slows down. And after my father passed away 6 years ago, she went on hiking trips to Italy and Wales and Scotland and all over the place. And very active. She enjoys life. In fact, she's getting together a party of her friends, of whom there are many, to go on a several days trip to the Outer Banks. And then, of course, she has to have a book group. She's 25 years older than the oldest member of it, other than herself. And they like to have her there. And so she's got a very bright mind, continues to be interested in everything. She takes classes at William and Mary. My father grew up rough. Immigrants to the United States in 1926. Didn't always fare well.
Immigrant from where?
Scotland, Aberdeen, Scotland, the Granite City. It's on the east coast of Scotland and is now one of the principal ports where North Sea oil is pumped onto the land for storage. Very different.
How old was he when he came to the United States?
He was enfant de sa mère. He wasn't born until August, and they'd been here, I think, 5 months. His two older sisters were born in Aberdeen, and he and his younger sister, Eleanor, were born in New Jersey. And he came down, he was heavily recruited, he was a very good athlete, and got a scholarship at William and Mary. He went to a pep rally one time, and my mother backed up from the bonfire and stepped on his foot. And that's how they met. And from William and Mary to the altar, to children, to little houses in suburbia. And they both worked very, very hard. And I am extremely proud of them.
Now, it was unusual for a lot of men at that time to be comfortable with their wives working outside of the home after they started having children. So do you know anything about that dynamic with your parents?
Sure do. Mama didn't work outside the home very much. She worked, but Pop had a carpenter come in and build a large table in the utility room with the washer. We didn't have a dryer, those hadn't come along yet. We hung the wet laundry on a line outside. And she would do laundry and set out copy and lay out and do that, while my sister and I helped, allegedly. She took us on visits to her clients when we were very small. And as we got into school, then she could visit clients, but she was home when we got home. And I never felt neglected at all. And as for my father, the thing my father wanted most in life was for my mother to be happy. And it was clear that her work outside of keeping the house going, keeping the children going, doing the laundry and so on, was not enough. And she needed this intellectual outlet. And as I say, and it's true of him generally, he was much happier when the people around him were happy. He was looking for their happiness, not his own. And as a consequence, unlike many of their friends, when they did something, went somewhere, went skiing at Bryce Mountain, or they went to Florida, or they went to New York City, we went with them. And they showed us around, and they might have one night out, but it was a family trip. They were all family trips until my sister and I were both in college. And then they would toddle off on their own. So we were all pretty tight, and fortunately, through luck or good training, my sister and I were good travelers and didn't fight much.
Now, your sister was the younger
Yes.
of the two of you, and what is your sister's name?
My sister's name is Linda Jean Bruce Palmer. She's married to a builder in Williamsburg, and she lives about a mile from where my mother lives now. My parents have had a great affinity for William and Mary. My mother's won the Alumni Medallion, which is their biggest alumni award. She's been president of their National Alumni Association. And she's done a good deal investing time and treasure in seeing that William and Mary progresses. And, you know, having played on the football team and been involved with Mama, well, Pop thinks William and Mary is just swell. So they decided when they retired to build a house in Kingsmill near the college and never regretted it for a moment. And my sister lives around the corner. And I'm so glad she does, because my mother and her mother were very close. And she saw her mother or spoke with her on the telephone every day, unless she was out of the country. My mother does the same thing for our mother. So, and Mama helps out. She always sends us the morning email. I'm going here, I'm going there, I have a meeting here, I have a meeting there. For two reasons: to let us know where we can go and collect her if she falls over, and so that we will know when we can email or telephone and she'll actually answer. Because you practically have to make an appointment with the woman, which makes me among the very blessed. I know too many of my friends who are caring for aged parents who are in necessitous circumstances or have physical ills. Mama doesn't have either of them. And she is, by nature, a happy person. She can't walk down the street in Williamsburg without saying hello to half a dozen people, even in tourist season. So she's well situated, and that makes me very happy.
Well, going back to growing up in Norfolk, and you mentioned going to church. So what church was important to your family?
We were Christadelphians, and I won't be surprised at all if you don't recognize that. The religion was established by a man named John Thomas in Birmingham, England in the 1880s. It is a Protestant, Christian, conservative church. Spend a lot of time studying the Bible and take it pretty much literally. It has remained small in the United States, and the thing that was important about this particular church was that I was related to everybody in it. The antecedents of my grandparents were Doziers, and they were all related. When my grandfather put the church together and built the building, well, we were all family. Second cousins sometimes, but family nonetheless. And that meant that it wasn't strange at all. It was expected and comfortable.
And so as you were growing up, were there, aside from your grandparents, especially your grandmother and your parents, were there any other people in your life who really impacted the way that you saw things, or maybe stimulated your interest in, because you indicated that you enjoyed reading.
Oh, yes.
And so Were there any people who helped to guide your intellectual development, the things that you enjoy in your off time?
Well, Mama started reading to me as soon as I could sit up, maybe before then. And I have had a lifelong love for reading. When I went to elementary school, they would take us, as part of the day's curriculum, to the library for half an hour. And we were allowed to select a book with the intention that we would finish it, hand it back to the librarian, and then go back to class. Over the 6 years I spent at Larimore, I read every book in the library except those designated for girls. We were not permitted to read them. And so I never got clued into whatever it is that makes up Amy Tan's success. But yeah, I read everything. I continue to read voraciously now. And it's a good thing, because in the job here, one of the things I do is read a lot of transcripts, a lot of manuscript records, look at a lot of exhibits, and it's good to know some of the larger words.
Do you have a favorite genre in literature?
I'd say biography and nonfiction. I am almost finished with the third volume on Winston Churchill that was started by William Manchester. He wrote the first 2 volumes, about 1,000 pages apiece. And then he had the bad grace to die, and a man named Paul Reed took 6 years to finish the third volume. And I'm also listening to on disc Shelby Foote's The Civil War and Narrative, and just, you know, for fun, I took a book down to the beach and read something as foolish as Daphne du Maurier or Dorothy L. Sayers. I like those. John Dixon Carr. I've read everything that Conan Doyle wrote. I've read everything that, oh, it's going to escape me now. That's so aggravating. John Steinbeck wrote, with the exception of Travels with Charlie. I don't know how I missed that. It's supposed to be the only happy one.
Well, it sounds as if you have your reading list set out for you.
Oh, no, not at all. What I had was the opportunity to select from a great many things. When Mama took my sister to Miss Preston's ballet school, she would drop me off at the Freemason Street Library, which is where my grandfather had gone to the library and self-educated his mind. And she would leave me there while they were at Miss Preston's and come get me in a couple of hours. So I learned early that there were lots and lots of things out there, and that there were no limits on what I could choose to read. And I've had a lot of vicarious experience.
So what was your favorite subject starting in elementary school and going up?
It may be best to begin with the subject I was least able to do, because it continues to this day. I do not do well with math facts. In fact, to my shame, I have from time to time followed my uncle's example, and when I've had a checking account for a certain amount of time, I will go to another bank, open a new account, do business out of that, and then see what's left in the other one. I'm not proud of that, but the facts are the facts. Writing is something that I enjoyed very much, since it is so closely akin to reading. And I'd say that was my favorite subject, always was. When I went to William and Mary, I was in the Honors English program. Oh, and I learned a lot, just an immense amount. And then I managed to get a class with a professor, a very small class. And this very learned gentleman was talking about a subject, and he found that everything he read involved penises And I decided, well, I didn't really need to know anything about that anymore. So I dropped out of the Honors English program. I got enough credits in accounting so that I could have graduated with that. But in the meantime, I took my optional classes, you know, the extracurriculars. And I got enough history credits so I could have graduated in that. So I really liked reading history. I chose to read mostly European history in college and then American history in the time since then.
So what did you actually major in college?
History.
History. And this, who's your major professor in?
You know, I was afraid you're going to ask that because until you did, I knew his name. And now I don't. But he was a real guiding force because I was taking history classes as electives. Professor McCord, Jim McCord, what a great guy. He was actually in his office and could be talked to when you were not in class, which was wonderful. And he helped restructure my class schedule so that, having gotten his permission to take graduate level classes, I could now sneak into the first year classes and the second year classes and make up what I had missed. He was so very helpful. And we had a very realistic idea about history and about writing about it, which I found instructive.
So what made you decide not to go on to graduate school in history? Instead, you went someplace else.
Well, I had an epiphany of sorts when I realized what history professors made in the way of compensation. And I decided that that was probably not a really good idea, and my father, being an accountant, wouldn't have approved of it. And I should say that through college, I never saw a bill. My parents paid for everything. And so I thought, well, I really don't want to go to work right now. I'm just a kid. So I thought, well, what am I good at? Well, I'm not a math person, but I am a word person, and there is a profession that uses words a lot to good effect. And I had the example of my Uncle Buddy, and we were all very close. He allowed me to see how his law firm worked. Later, when I was in law school, he let me stay there for a summer and get some practical experience. And so that's what took me to law school and wound up at the University of Richmond.
When exactly did you have your epiphany? What year were you in college?
The closer we got to graduation and the cutoff of funds from home, the more interested I was. So I'd say after Christmas junior year, that's probably, and I really started thinking hard about, could I make a living doing this, that, or the other?
Did you think of going to any other law school?
Oh, I applied to lots of law schools. It brings up a story which I'm afraid will not redound in a good light to the college. Being a rule-following boy, I was taught that by my mother. When they announced the time when Princeton, as part of the Educational Testing Service, wanted our materials, they then collected everything and directed them to the several schools to which we had applied. I went down to the registrar, William & Mary, paid $12 for 6 certified transcripts, and they wouldn't give them to me, of course, but they said that they would send them to Princeton. I had done pretty well at William & Mary. I was not Phi Beta Kappa, and nobody was going to nominate me for Rhodes Scholarship, although fraternity of brothers of mine got each of those. I thought I would get in somewhere. Well, I started getting rejections, and then I got more rejections. The out-of-state ones, I wasn't too surprised. But then I got one from William & Mary, and I thought, wonder what's going on here. Well, I found out on December the 19th, the day the school closed for the Christmas break. A man from Princeton said, "We're sending you your money back. You clearly don't want to apply to any of these law schools. We've never received your transcript, so we'll be sending you a refund." Well, we had a very short, brisk conversation. And I found out that the registrar at WNM had taken my $12, put it in the cash drawer, deposited it, and then did nothing afterwards. Well, that sounds like a bad thing. It turned out, as sometimes things do, to have been a blessing. Because right after college, I married my high school sweetheart and then realized that I had to have employment. And we went through law school together. Again, a crisis of employment. So I thought, well, what can I do? Well, I could have pulled a string at William & Mary because my mother was the president of the National Alumni Society. And I thought, nah, you don't want to get in any place you don't belong. So I called Rob Baldwin, who was then the Dean of Admissions at the University of Richmond's Law School. He subsequently became the executive secretary and was here in that capacity when I came on as a law clerk in 1976. So he's been helping me along all the way.
Now, you knew him before you gave him a call?
No, I didn't know him from Adam's off ox. But I called the admissions office. They put me through to him, told him how I had done on the LSAT, which was very, very well. And I told him what my grades were. "Can you send me copies of that stuff?" "Sure, but they're not going to be authenticated. There's nobody here. Just send me your copies." So I did. We arranged an interview, and in 2 weeks I was in. And I thought how glad I was that we had not stayed in Williamsburg, because my wife had graduated with a degree in education and was ready to teach elementary school children. And you can imagine how many jobs were open in Williamsburg for that. 0. She would have wound up waiting tables, which there's nothing wrong with, but it doesn't further your education. So we went to Richmond. And she got the 298th of 298 new teaching positions. And so she got her PhD, putting hubby through. And she taught elementary school. Parents, again, paid tuition and books. And that's how we did it. And had I gotten in at William & Mary, it would have been a disaster. As it was, we pulled disaster from the jaws of defeat and turned it into a really good time. And I believe I got a very good education in Richmond.
So let me go back for just a minute. You mentioned that that your wife was your high school sweetheart. So
that's right.
Tell me a little bit about that. When exactly did you meet her?
Well, we were both 16 years old, and I had seen her at Norview. And she and I, and a bunch of different people, had transferred to Lake Taylor. I saw more of her there. And in the middle of the winter, we went on a field trip. And you know how that goes. When we went on the field trip, sat next to each other, held her hand, it was like being plugged into the electrical socket. And we never dated anybody else from then on until we got married. She went off to Longwood for a year, then finished at Old Dominion. And the day she was supposed to go to graduation at ODU, we got married in the backyard of my grandparents' house, where 25 years to the day earlier, my parents had gotten married. So I'm sure she didn't know what she was into, but she took the chance.
And when did you all start having children?
Oh, we waited a long time because I was keenly aware of liability, something I learned in law school. And it was not until, we'd been married for 7 years, that our first child, Sarah, came along Oh man, most exciting, most terrifying experience I've ever had, even though it all went splendidly. And
Why was it terrifying?
well, you know, they show you that movie. That woman from California who apparently isn't embarrassed by anything. I was one of the 3 guys who left about at a critical moment. And, you know, you hope they'll have all their fingers and toes. Expectations were not high. We would settle for 1 complete child. And we'd never done it before. And, well, it was just terrifying. Would I get her to the hospital on time? Would everything go fine? In law school, you read malpractice cases, and a lot of them have to do with birth injuries, and I'm thinking, oh, Lord, please don't let that happen. Well, it went just fine. And she was beautiful, and we just were totally infatuated. 5 years later, she was joined by a sister named Meredith. And then 2.5 years after that, a son whose name is Alex. Sarah died at the age of 19 in 1999 from leukemia. She had had 2 long bouts of it. And that was thoroughly awful. And it brought our marriage to an end. I take some comfort from the fact that the folks at MCV say, there's only 2 things can happen after what you've been through. Either you will be joined together with cement forever, or you don't have a chance. And I'm afraid we wound up in the don't have a chance category. So we got divorced in 2000. And Meredith, I believe, is still living with her. Alex went off and joined the Marine Corps after he got out of high school. I wondered the wisdom about joining the Marine Corps in the time of a shooting war. We were shooting at Iraqis at that time. But he got into the 3rd Marine Air Wing and was putting ordnance on jets. And they sent him to Al Assad Air Base for 6 months. And he came back with everything he had brought with him. The Marine Corps taught him a lot of things, in addition to scratching and spitting and some new cuss words. Gave him a great deal of confidence, and he's very glad he went through it.
Is he still in the Marines?
No, he did 4 years and then out, because he should be in VCU now, but in as much as he was a grown man, he comes and goes as he pleases and doesn't feel the need to let me know just where that is, which is fine. You raise them to be independent.
Yeah. So tell me about your law school experience when you were, when you first entered, and some of the professors that you encountered, and when you decided to really make law your permanent profession.
I was scared to death because I had heard that you only got 1 test in a class, and that was the whole grade. And I thought, well, if you have a bad day, it could really hurt you. So being married at the time made a great difference, since the majority of students were not. And so I studied a lot. I knew she was working hard teaching children. I needed to work hard. Besides that, we only had 1 car, and once I was at school, I couldn't leave. I did well and wound up in top third of my class. I took a few classes that I'd have to say were not what I had hoped for. There's always the professor who begins his sentence up here and then winds up talking about like this. That was tough, but I bought a study guide from a 3rd year, aced it. So I booked the class, that was great. I learned that there were definitely classes I was interested in, classes that were laden with facts, told a story, evidence, criminal law, torts. I all found very interesting. I felt duty-bound, though, having seen my uncle's success in the world of business, estates, and trust, to think, well, if you're going to make any money, you ought to learn about death and greed. So I did wills and trusts, and corporate tax, and future interests. Now, there was a threat. Rodney Johnson taught that class. He is the fairest and best professor I know. I never questioned a grade he gave me, and I took a fair number of his classes. I can't say that about all the others. Some classes I would study myself senseless and get a C. Others I'd read the outline, go to class, hope for the best, and get an A. No explaining it. But Mr. Johnson called him as he saw him. And the year before, he had failed 2 third-year students who then, instead of being able to graduate, had to take summer school classes, and because they had taken the bar, were not eligible to be licensed to practice and had to take it again. Because that time, you could take the bar in February, and if you graduated in May, you were licensed and good to commit malpractice throughout the Commonwealth. So I thought, I think I'll take a few insurance classes. So I took about 9 hours worth of material that I didn't really need to have. And then I got an A. I couldn't believe it. It was like that story Winston Churchill tells on himself. At Harrow, he had to face the prospect of being asked to draw in considerable detail a map of some part of the British Empire. Well, he put all the names in a hat, drew out New Zealand, learned it. That's what they asked for on the test. As it was, I had studied Ballantyne, who was an authority on future interests. As a consequence, I recognized some of the questions and felt like I had a shot. It turns out I did. So I graduated with 12 credits that I didn't specifically need, but was glad to have.
Had you thought about where you would be going, or had you imagined that you would start off in private practice after you finished law school?
I had never thought of anything other than going back to Norfolk. I mean, that was home. You know, and my mother's family, the nuts didn't fall very far from the tree. My 8 cousins were still 20 minutes away in Norfolk or Virginia Beach. My grandparents were still there. My parents were still there. And I thought, well, my uncle does have a law firm. Maybe they might want to hire me. Turns out they didn't, because they got this anti-nepotism policy, I think just for me. But it never occurred to me to go to a clerkship until I found out about it. And when I did, I applied. To be candid, I was on the edge academically. I had, I thought, very good grades, top quarter of the class. And I had done well, and I had taken challenging courses. But you know, there were probably 60 or 70 people applying for 4 spaces. So the odds were not good. But I lucked out, and in April, Mr. Irons called me and said, do you want a job here? And I can tell you exactly what I told him. I said, Mr. Irons, when I see an offer that's too good to miss, the only words to say are, I agree. And so I started in June or July of '76, and I liked it from the beginning. It was something that my mind was set up to do, summarizing things, reading a lot of things, and then trying to write those things that I had acquired in a way that was both short, concise, and made sense. You got all the information in, but it didn't take you 18 pages to do it. And once I got the hang of it, I hope you'll forgive me, but this is simply subjective. I thought it was something I did well. And you know how it is with things you do well. I thought, this is the place for me. And after working a year for Mr. Irons, I left to go to Norfolk, got a job, a very, very nice firm. And swore as I left the building, which was then over on Broad Street between 10th and Governor, I said, if Mr. Irons ever leaves his job, I'm going to apply. Little did I know that within 13 months, Mr. Irons would drop over of a heart attack at the age of 54 on Thursday of session week. And I put in a call to then Chief Justice Anson and told him, I'm working at a really great firm, but I had promised myself that I would apply for this job and I really want it. And he, being the gracious man he was, said, I tell you what, I'll take it up with the court. If there's good news, you'll hear from me. If you don't hear from me, you don't hear from me. I said, that's great. Couldn't be better. My wife then predicted, you will get that job the day I hang the last piece of wallpaper in this bathroom. And that was right. He called at 5 o'clock. She was just coming off the ladder after hanging the last blessed piece of it, and invited me to come to court in November. Had a discussion with the full court. They agreed to employ me. I had to scramble to close up my practice in a month. Only time I ever worked Christmas Day. But I was up here January 2nd, and they've let me stay since then.
So what year was that you arrived?
January 1st, 1979.
And what was it like leaving Norfolk, because you had envisioned yourself being at home surrounded by all of your relatives?
You know, I never gave them a second thought. Isn't that terrible? I thought, this is something I really want to do. And I can drive to Norfolk. And as much as I loved my law partners, and believe me, you'll rarely find a better law firm than Hofheimer & Nussbaum, which is where I was. They treated me very generously. They gave me good work to do. And I had the temerity to include with my application to work with them a letter from Chief Justice Anson. And Chief Justice Anson, being the gracious man he was, called Bob Nussbaum and said, we're going to take one of your people away, hope you don't mind. To which Bob, after hanging up the phone, said to the firm, the Chief Justice giveth, the Chief Justice taketh away. I was sad to leave them because I didn't know then what I know now, that once you are here, the kind of things you hear on the street, the kinds of things that you hear in bar association meetings, the things you hear at lunch from your other lawyers. I knew who was building the buildings. I knew who was in financial problems. I was even able, as a younger member of the firm, to invest in some things that ordinarily I couldn't have invested in. All the limits were too high. But they would let us divide it. And once divided by 5, it was inconvenient, but possible. So that all went away. And that's what I miss, is not knowing what's going on outside of here. I was very glad to know a whole lot of what was going on in here. But I do miss that, still do.
So what are some of the things that you enjoyed learning on the inside?
Oh my gosh. One of the best things about my job is that you never really see the same thing twice. Yes, in 35 years, I've probably seen 1,000 burglary cases. But you know, they're all different. They do it a different way. They say a different thing. They are all different. But it was necessary for me to learn that we were not grinding out sausages. And that was important to me because I found it was easy to say, well, this is my 89th B&E from Portsmouth. It's going to be like number 88. And then I would get into it and say, wait a minute, this is not the same. And I found that being aware that they were all different was very helpful in avoiding a case that really needed a closer look. And I found that to be very useful. I learned quickly to write what I had to say more briefly than I said it. You won't believe that after I've run on like this. But it is possible to write down the essentials of a criminal appeal or a civil appeal in 4 to 10 pages if you learn what to leave out. And that's the secret. It's not knowing what to put in, it's knowing what to leave out.
So give me an example of how you learned this.
Well, I can tell you that they teach you to write in college in a certain way. They always have page limits, and you're always eking out that last 9th page or 10th page. Here, the opposite applied. We don't want 10 pages. We'll take 4. We may compromise on 5, but no more. And it didn't take long at the hands of Mr. Irons, who edited a great deal of our work, especially if it was going to a panel of justices who would hear argument in person from the lawyers. He would edit our stuff. He would spend a couple of hours with it, and then a couple of hours with us. And we would fight for 10 minutes over a comma. Was it supposed to be a comma, or did it need to be a semicolon? And he wrote extremely well, and he taught us to write with considerable brevity. And once I got the trick of learning what to leave out, and I did that in 2 ways. First of all, Mr. Irons told me. And second, I learned to put myself in the position of my reader. Well, did I need to know that his grandma had just driven the Dodge Valiant into a snowbank? Well, no, not really. It's kind of interesting, but nah. Once I had learned the things to leave out, the things that would be important to the justices, and learned to focus on the questions, the assignments of error, and the facts that should go with them, and the facts that didn't even need to be discussed, it became much easier. But practice makes perfect, and I'm still trying to improve.
So tell me a little bit more about Mr. Irons, and tell me a little bit about his personality and what just a normal day working with him was all about.
Sure. I liked Mr. Irons. He taught us a great deal. And he was an interesting man. He was married to his wife Elizabeth. He had been born in Radford. He went to W&L's law school. He and Elizabeth had no children. His time in the Marine Corps had given him a kind of, let's say, rigid demeanor. He had taps on his shoes, and since we were in a building that had 1939 linoleum in it, I'm telling you, the minute he stepped out of his office, you knew where he was going, which was very good for law clerks. You could go hide in the stacks if you didn't really need to see him. He had a drill field voice, and in that circle that was the floor where the justices and the law clerks and the law library were all located, all on one floor. And there was a square, or rectangle, that was the hallway that served everything. And if you dropped a paper clip at one end of it, you heard it at the other. He could waken everybody, especially if you went in your office and closed the door. And he would talk for 45 minutes, and at the end, when he would leave, you'd think, wow, you rarely hear a bazooka go off indoors. He was very committed to the court's work. He thought it was important. It was worth however much time it took to get it right. And he spent as much time as he believed was appropriate with each of us to make sure, especially at the beginning, that we got the right ideas, that we understood how valuable the work was, that for most cases this was the last stop on the bus line, and that it was very important to the litigants, and that to the extent the court would grant a case and write an opinion on it, it was important to the development of the law and deciding serious political and public questions. So that was a lot of things to learn. He, let me think. He didn't write so many cases as we did, which is only appropriate. He was running the place. But he was an inveterate list maker. He could tell me how I was doing in my case better than I could, because every day, morning and afternoon, he made the rounds and found out how we were doing. And if we weren't moving along fast enough, he didn't mind encouraging you to move a little faster. But he contributed to my writing a lot, and I appreciate that. He also had an encyclopedic knowledge of what's in the Virginia reports. Bear in mind, there were no computers, much less legal research computers. So whatever you knew because it was in your head. And I can see him now in the library. He would walk along the stacks until he saw a date, and he'd think, yeah, that's about right. I think it was old Judge Bazile, and he'd take down a volume, and he'd flip through it, and then the name of the case would hit him. He'd look down and say, yeah, it was Judge Bazile. Take this case back to your office. I think it's got the solution to your problem. Well, we'd never really seen anything like that. It was pretty phenomenal. And so he helped us understand that we had to start remembering these things.
How many law clerks were there?
4. It had started out with fewer than that. I believe that Mr. Irons began in 1970 as special assistant to the court. And I think at that time he had 2 law clerks, and then within a year or two it was increased to 4. And it was 4 when I arrived there as a law clerk. I did bring a list. I don't want to forget anything. I know that he was buried in Radford, and a great many members of the courts attended. He, I think from time to time, wondered if he had really been a great success that he'd wanted to be. But that's just my personal opinion. He, I told you about the taps. It's like belling the cat. He smoked a pipe, and let's see. He was the one who distributed the caseload to us. Caseload that went to the justices' law clerks came direct from the clerk's office. That would change later. His editing, dear me. He had worked for Woods Rogers, and he had been an assistant United States attorney for the Western Division, and Judge Robert Marriage, who had presided over some of those cases, had befriended me in University of Richmond's law school when I took a couple of classes and got to be acquainted with him. And he told me that in those cases, Mr. Irons made one of the best closing arguments he had ever heard. So he was distinctly not a lightweight. He'd practiced at Wood Rogers. He knew a lot of things. He was a good fit because he taught us, and he knew a lot to tell us. I hope that's helpful. It's really pretty much all I know.
Well, this was the time before the creation of the Court of Appeals.
Yes.
And so I understand that there were lots of cases that were backlogged, and so what was that like? What kind of pressure were you all under to really go through this huge docket?
It was pretty considerable. But I thought we kept up very well considering the virtually numberless amount of cases. It's also important to remember that before the Court of Appeals, divorce litigation, support litigation, both temporary and permanent, could come up any number of times. I remember working on a case that had 7 distinct appeals in a divorce case before it was over. So you can imagine what that did to the caseload. The court also received all the workers' compensation cases. And while they were not always lengthy, the consequences for the appellants were especially important. It had a great deal of bearing on how they would financially live the rest of their lives. That's not to say that every appeal isn't important. It is. It's important for so many reasons. It's expensive to get up here. A lot of times there's a lot of money, a lot of stake, a lot of prestige, so many things. People don't appeal civil cases just for kicks and giggles. And the appellate criminal cases then that didn't go through the Court of Appeals were important because people were actually going to be in prison, sometimes for a very long time. And for most practical purposes, this was the end of the line. The people who got habeas corpus relief, either in this court or in the federal courts, was very small. I mean, there was a lot of talk about federal activism in the post-conviction world, but if you look at the numbers, they didn't let many people out. So we got, from the beginning, a sense of being the last stop on the bus line, we have to do the best we can.
Now, when you were a clerk, were there any cases that you found particularly challenging?
Oh, May, particularly challenging. Yes, there was a case from Northern Virginia that involved a construction contract for a very large apartment building. And there were so many disputes between them. I can't begin to number them, but it arrived here in 33 boxes. And I thought, anyway, I can read all that. Fortunately, a lot of it was exhibits and depositions, and I could minimize those. There was a domestic relations case that was up here 7 times. I couldn't get rid of it. It was stuck to me like glue. And at that time, there were changes in the death penalty going on. And at the time, I received 2 death penalty cases as a law clerk. And that was under the scheme where if you were convicted of a capital murder, there was only one punishment. And of course, you know, it has evolved greatly since then. But the 2 of those cases that I worked on, I found were important for a variety of reasons. One of them being nobody had ever really done one before. And second, it was a moral dilemma. I have to tell you, I struggled with that quite a lot. And the reason I did was because the court's composition then was such that Justices Carrico and Poff and Harmon and Compton were very accessible. And I could have walked into Justice Harry Carrico's chambers and said, I have this case, here's what it's about, and I'm troubled. And later on, when I came back and had quite a steep learning curve, I was very grateful that his door was open. And so I wondered whether in not going to the court and saying, here's my personal moral view, I was being less than I should be. But then I thought, not your call, not your problem. They'll do the best they can, and it isn't your call, so butt out. And that's how I had to leave it, because they continued to come, and I wound up working on 64 of them over the years in various forms, as Supreme Court precedent caused changes in the law, both statutory and decisional. And they got more and more complicated, and I'm sad to say, more and more truly upsetting. The actions involved didn't get better. I would say, finally, I've seen the worst of it. And then 2 months later, they'd up the ante. But enough about that. It was fabulous to learn about it and to be close enough to see how this court was dealing with what the Supreme Court of the United States was doing. It was a very interesting time.
When you became then the special assistant, what did you do that perhaps may have been different and similar to what
Well,
Mr.
I never
Irons?
became the special assistant. When Mr. Irons died, that title was abandoned. And when I came to the court in 1978 to discuss my employment, the justices said that they also planned to change the title, and did I mind? I said, I don't care what you call it. In my head, I just need to feed my family. But Justice Poff told me that he was the one who thought it up. Another member of the court has also told me he was the one who thought it up. And I'm really not in a position to tell you who thought it up, but it suited me, and that's where we started with Chief Staff Attorney. And I was flattered. I had my name on the Supreme Court of Virginia letterhead. And I thought, I'm going to send some of this to my mother. I was delighted. But I also knew there was a steep learning curve, because Mr. Irons had helped us with the work. But as far as protocols about how work got handed out, when it needed to be done, who scheduled what time limits were, the relationship between the Chief Staff Attorney's office and the clerk's office, I knew nothing about that. Fortunately, David Beach, who had been a law school classmate, who had been a law clerk in the special assistant's office, had moved up to the clerk's office where he was a deputy clerk. And Justice Carrico always had his door open. And David had pretty much run the office, doing two jobs, for the time between Mr. Irons' death in August and my employment in January. And when I arrived, there was a 750 case backlog in my office. I don't know what it was among the justices, but I suspect it was nothing like as big as was there. But it took us 2 years to clear it and to get caught up. So we worked pretty hard. And I cannot emphasize enough the accessibility of the justices as far as help, and my friend David Beach's very patient assistance. And I'm proud to say that for the time we were here, the clerk's office and the Chief Staff Attorney's office worked very well together because we could talk to each other. And I'm proud of that. It was not always so.
How many attorneys did you have working with you?
4. The 4 I had inherited from Mr. Irons.
Did you expand that number at all?
At first, no. Although I immediately had to start recruiting people because none had been done. It stayed at 4 for quite a while, and then to 5, and then to 6. But it didn't assume the larger proportions it has now, where there are 12 lawyers, until about 10 or 11 years ago, as the caseload got closer to total 3,000. The Chief Staff Attorney's Office processes all the original jurisdiction cases, habeas, mandamus, prohibition. They are all pre-screened by me. to see if there are ways to deal with them earlier in the process than later. And then there are probably 2,200 appeals of various kinds. Now, they were not always that way when I started. It started around 1900. When we got to 1984 and the creation of the Court of Appeals, we had a real drop-off, and things were easy going there for a while. But they caught up, and by 12 years ago, the numbers total were around 3,000.
What accounted for the significant increase?
Not being a sociologist or a student of criminology, I can only guess that people, as money got tighter, were fighting over more things in the civil arena, because the cases continued to grow, even though two very large segments we had previously handled were now gone. And the other is crime. There was plenty of it. They kept catching them, convicting them. Court of Appeals would affirm or refuse an appeal. Didn't cost them anything, so they sent it right on along. Now, that seems like a frivolous way to approach it, but I think it's pretty much horseback accurate. And you can see that as things got too expensive to appeal, civils dropped off. Yeah.
Now, you talked about your relationship with the different justices.
Yes.
And I was wondering, who was the Chief Justice when you came in?
Lawrence W. I. Anson. He was known to his friends as Red, because he had very red hair as a young man. By the time I met him, he was in his 70s, and the red hair had gone gray. He lived in Portsmouth, and if ever there was a king of Portsmouth, he would be it. He was first citizen. He was the best-loved man in that city. And he did so much good working on the Constitution of 1970, in which he played a large part. And his presence in Tidewater was, for a long time, the only presence of this court in that entire Hampton Roads area. And so he was a very large force. But he was, to me, a very gentle person. I cannot say that he suffered fools gladly. But he was out of town, and I did not see very much of him. The person I saw the most was Justice Harry Carrico, and for that I will be ever thankful. He was one of the most intelligent, civilized, disciplined lawyers I have, and judges, I've ever met. He was an enormous help to me. And he had all the things you want from a judge or a justice. He had the temperament. He would sit there and be patient until it was really not time to be patient anymore. Somebody needed to be told to be quiet and sit down. But he always knew when that was. He always studied well ahead of time. He knew the cases. He knew the briefs. He asked helpful questions. He could be in the courtroom a great stone face. More than one lawyer walked out of there shaking his head. Boy, that guy in the middle really hates my guts. But he was not at all that way. He was just concentrating. He wrote all his opinions himself, so far as I know. He had been a judge nearly all his life, having started out as trial justice in Fairfax, then circuit judge in Fairfax, and then to this court in 1961. Now, he had experience, and he had that God-given gift of putting his foot right. I would take a problem into him, and he might say, oh, well, here's the way we can solve that. But then sometimes he'd say, you know, I think we just let that one alone. And sure enough, In 5 or 6 days, it had solved itself. But he knew which ones, and I never figured out how. I like to believe, and maybe I flatter myself, that we got to be friends. He ranks as a great man. I also got to be friends with Governor Albertus Harrison, who was a member of this court, with Justice George Cochran, Justice Richard Poff, and Justice Chris Compton. I was not on such good terms with others who were further away. I didn't know Justice Harmon very well. But it seems to me that at that time, the justices welcomed comments from the people who had actually worked on the cases. A number of justices wanted to put their hand in the wound, so to speak. So you had to have a file there. And you could say what you thought. They might do something about it. They might think you were full of beans. But it had gone, 2 years before I arrived as a law clerk, mandatory recommendations. I arrived, hope there's no relation, no more recommendations, just the facts, ma'am. And here, not but so long ago, we're back to recommendations. So the wheel has gone all the way around.
What changed? What made that whole scenario change?
A number of things. First, this building. The 1939 WPA project that was the Supreme Court State Library building was one of the oddest buildings you ever saw in your life. It is now the Patrick Henry building and is quite lovely. Back then, it was 2 buildings in one. On this side, near Capitol Square, you entered the State Law Library. You entered the State Library. But you didn't go from floor 1 to floor 2. You went from floor 1 to floor 3, and then to 5. On the other side, on the Broad Street side, you had the Supreme Court of Virginia, but you also had the Virginia State Law Library, the clerk's office, and the Attorney General's office. And I mean, we were all very close. It did have a wonderful advantage, though, and that is that in inclement weather, you could go downstairs to the steam pipe system, which runs under quite a bit of the seat of government, and you could walk underground to the Capitol, get a sandwich at Chickens, and walk back dry as a bone. The justices then parked their car in Capitol Square. The rest of us, well, I took the bus. It was just, we had one car, and it was being used to take her to the East End to teach. Then they had the bus strike, and David Beach and I sort of traded off. My wife would drive us to court, his wife would drive us home. But this building was a huge, huge difference when we occupied it in 1981, particularly when the Attorney General got their own place at 900 East Main. Now this has consolidated all of the court's, well, virtually all of the court's central functions, including IT, payroll, finance, the Executive Secretary's office. And you need to understand that that is a huge undertaking. And Carl Hayde, who is the Executive Secretary, is just, how he gets it done, I don't know. He's an amazing guy. When we got over here, within a couple of years, we got computers. In the other building, I would write my memo out in longhand with a pencil on a 14-inch legal pad paper. I would hand it to our one secretary, who would type it in rough on yellow pad paper. And by the way, she had the Selectric 1. That was the one where you backed up, you put in the little piece of paper, or you put in the whiteout, things didn't go quickly. And then we would get our rough back. Mr. Irons would edit it, sometimes at length. After all the changes had been made and approved, it would then be retyped on yellow line 14-inch paper. There was no word processing. There was no way to look anything up. I had a case that involved a case that was decided in 1929 apparently being the solution to the problem, and the question was, had it been changed? I had every decennial digest from 1929 to 1969 on the floor of the library. And let me tell you, that was a labor of love, because it really was not pleasant. Those things changed everything. And all of a sudden, we could do more. Not that we spent less time, but there was more to do. We could do more comprehensive research. We could process the words and change sentences and modify things that before we might have foregone because there wasn't enough time. And a lot of things didn't change for a very long time. Justices Carrico, Poff, Compton stayed in this court as active members of the court for a long time. And overall, there was relatively little change in the personnel of the court. The biggest of them being the arrival of Justice Elizabeth Lacey. And contrary to the movie First Monday in October, we didn't have any jokes about how to call her Justice Lacey. Before that, I will confess that the justices were addressed Mr. Justice Compton. And the court didn't have any problem with that. They just said, we'll leave that off. And away they went. That was a huge change. And then, about 10 years after that, we had a large number of people leave the court for a variety of reasons. When he got to age 75, Justice Cochran retired, and I will say he told me that he did so because, well, after all, I did draft the statute. Governor Harrison took semi-retirement, but you know, for a man who had been and done everything in state government, who had been on this court for a considerable time, he was happy to receive law clerk work, and he would write up the cases to be heard at petitions. And then Justice Poff took senior status, and that meant that in a short time we got a substantial number of new justices. Justice Stevenson, Stevenson, and Justice Russell, and Carrington Thompson came in then, though he did not stay very long. And there was a time there, about 8 years, where things were relatively settled. If you look at our present court, you'll see three interesting things. When I was employed here as a law clerk, the youngest member of the court was its most recent appointee, Justice Compton. He was 45. Look at our present court. You'll see some 30s up there. Look at somebody like Justice John Charles Thomas, who was the first African-American justice. He's my age. He was 33 when he started on this court. That's 11 years younger than the previous record holder. And in my opinion, it's a lot of time. Because I think the best thing you can do for yourself here is to have spent a little time on the planet, just seeing how things go in the ordinary life. But then followed a whole bunch of new faces. Justice Kinzer, Justice McClanahan, Justice Millett, Justice Mims, Justice Lemons, Justice Goodwin. all in a very short time. So now the justices don't consist of 2 or 3 at the top who've been there 20 years, and then some in the middle, and some who are younger. It's all pretty much younger and then a little older than younger. It's pretty amazing, the change, particularly the fact that women and men are now as equal as things can be, unless we're going to cut somebody in half. And all of those things are very different. And along the way, the court, suiting the predilections of each individual, have approached things a different way. We prepare materials in a different format. The length which we are permitted to write is different. The goals of that writing are slightly different.
In what way?
Well, there's some things I can't tell you. It's not that they're secret, it's just that these are instructions I received from the court and I simply can't tell you. And it's not really important, the individual nature of the changes. It's just that the now 10 lawyers in the Chief Staff Attorney's Office have to learn to do it a different way. And that is in process. And so everyone is doing their best to do what we've been instructed to do. And it isn't always easy, and we don't always get it right.
Now, have you noticed if there was a difference between when you first came in under Chief Justice Hyanson, and then of course you had Chief Justice Carrico, and then you had Chief Justice Hassell. Was there any difference in the way that you interacted with the court under these different Chief Justices, or was it pretty much the same up through that point?
Very different.
Explain how it was different.
With Justice Hyanson, Chief Justice Hyanson, much of the procedural work that would otherwise have flowed to the Chief Justice, where you needed the leader of the court to say yes, no, on non-substantive things, it wasn't logistically reasonable to try to do that, since he lived in Portsmouth and we were up here. So Justice Carrico took on that job of, we need a decision to these procedural or ancillary things, he could give it. And I say to his generosity of spirit that he was very easy to get hold of, and for a variety of reasons. He had long conferences with people from the clerk's office to dispose of a variety of motions and problems. Same thing with my office, though not nearly as many. But it was rare the day that I couldn't just walk in and say, do you have a minute? When he was no longer Chief Justice and Justice Hassell became Chief Justice, it was very different. About that time, I stopped being Chief Staff Attorney and became a staff attorney. Greg Lusick took the position of Chief Staff Attorney. From my observations, I can see that Chief Justice Hassell seemed to be perfectly happy making up his mind and telling people what to do. I don't recall there being great long discussions with Greg, though I could be wrong, and you probably should ask him. And with Chief Justice Kinzer now, partly because she's in Pennington Gap, I don't know the extent to which she deals with particular things. But a lot of the procedures about how does a procedural problem get decided by a panel, that's changed. We now have a procedural panel. And it's made possible because we have teleconferencing and video conferencing, and because we have computers that can send duplicated papers to everybody who needs to be in on the discussion. So technology and the change in personnel, I would say, are the two big things.
Did it take you long to adapt to the new technology?
Oh, yeah. Oh, at first, I'm ashamed of this, but it's true. Susie Greenstreet, who has now worked in the Chief Staff Attorney's office for 28 years and is one of the most capable people I know, was working as a secretary. That was what it was called then. It's called something else now, administrative assistant, I think. And at first, I was so afraid of email, I said, just print everything out in hard copy and I'll read it. Well, I didn't know how to do all this. But first of all, I didn't know how to type. That was a real drawback. So eventually, I did catch on. I do not understand its nuances, but I get by. But it took a while. There are lots of people, though, in the office who grew up with it and are perfectly comfortable. I use it as a typewriter.
And so the technology changed in many ways the way that you all handled information,
Oh, yes.
transferred information.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it helped to improve the way that you all did your job, or it simply changed it to some degree?
I never did anything to the law clerk's writing except edit it. I didn't look at the things they were going to present to the court after an initial training period. It used to be that cases that were not argued, cases that were argued to the chief staff attorney, and there were many of them, and still are, the court had authorized Mr. Irons and me and Mr. Lusick and now Mr. Stroman to hear argument on petitions for appeal in criminal cases where the lawyers do not object. And at the beginning, all those, what we call CSA orals, and no orals, where the lawyers don't want to say anything, we presented to the court across the table. We simply told them about it. Now, the vast majority of those cases are handled in writing. We process it, we send it to Susie or another administrative type person. They shoot them to the panels, and we don't talk to them unless they want to talk to us. One panel does continue to allow a limited number of lawyers to present their cases orally, and they are often presented orally in the procedure panel where there's a procedural as opposed to substantive issue. So there's a big change in the way we present. There's not a great deal of change in what we were doing. The purpose, the mission hasn't changed. But it's easier to do it with all the electronics. It gets to people faster. You don't have to wait for mail anymore. So most of that has been very beneficial. The only downside I feel is because we do not see the justices across the table every 7 weeks, and I can only speak for myself, I don't feel I know them as well as I used to know the justices when I was the chief staff attorney. And I'm sad by that because the 7 active members of the court who were here became my friends. And they taught me so much. Not necessarily in the course of the discussion or the decision of a case. We would have to wait around from time to time, and they'd tell me stories. They'd tell me how things worked out and why. And you can't get that information anyplace else. And I treasure it.
Did you have opportunities to socialize with the justices?
Not really. There were occasions when an individual justice might invite me to his home, as was the case with Justice Carrico and with Justice Cochran and Governor Harrison. We did, for a very long time, have a cocktail party where clerks were invited and the justices would circulate. But that was really about all. In the early years, the justices had supper together during the session, and during the General Assembly session, they had dinner with the governor. I don't know but what those have maybe gone by the board. I know the clerks' party's gone. Whether they dined together during session, I do not know. Of course, I don't know about the situation with going to the governor's mansion. It's just not part of what I know. Out of my pay grade.
I was wondering, were there any cases that came across your desk that were particularly challenging, especially in the 1980s and 1990s?
Well, very few cases that were politically charged came across my desk. I don't know why, just luck of the draw. But if you mean serious cases, well, 62 death penalty cases, I think pretty much answers that question. As far as other things, well, sure. The first set of church division cases between hierarchical and non-hierarchical cases, they would come through, something like them. A lot of zoning would come through where a giant mall would be proposed and the citizenry would be irate. And those would, cause a lot of stir. I can't really right off the hand tell you, this case was more important than that case. And maybe that's because I have succeeded in doing what I planned, which was to make them all important. Some were easier than others, but they're all important. There's too much at stake.
Now, there were, I think, one or two cases that ended up getting some notice because they went to the Supreme Court.
Like Atkins.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And tell me what that was like to have that kind of case.
I can only tell you about the beginning.
Okay.
One thing to understand about the Chief Staff Attorney's Office is we only fight the fire at one end of the street, and that's winnowing out those cases the court wishes to hear and write an opinion on from the larger number they think are essentially correct and which they refuse an appeal. So that's our job. Get it to the point where it's granted or refused. Once it's been granted, it goes up onto the docket maintained by the clerk's office. And then after that, the docket draw determines who gets which case, what weight they have, and that is simply none of my business. It's just the way it is. So I'm simply not able to answer your question.
No, but that is an answer. And I was also wondering, were there any cases that troubled you? You had a recommendation and it was either ignored or wasn't taken fully into account.
At the risk of maybe stepping over a line, I can tell you that I have had a couple of cases that I was troubled by. They occurred early in my career. In fact, both of them came across my desk when I was a 25-year-old law clerk, and I think much of my confusion and concern is attributable to my youth and inexperience. However, be that as it may, I still remember the facts, even though it's been 37 years ago. One was an incest case, and it was one of those classic believe the child, believe the father. Father didn't even have a traffic ticket. Child had some troubles. It was a jury trial. Did it trouble me? Yes. Why? Because if I'd been a juror, I might have come down differently. But that's not the appellate standard, so I learned a lesson from that. I learned the lesson in another case, the robbery case, and I presented it to the then very stern Richmond panel, which was composed of Justices Carrico, Poff, and Compton. And as they were all very, very gifted, not only as to intelligence and education, they knew the pointed questions to ask. Well, I walked in there, babe in the woods, and said, I'm troubled by this robbery case. And Justice Carrico looked at me and said, and then he went down the elements of robbery. Did they probe so-and-so? If you believe the Commonwealth's evidence, yes, sir. He went right down the list. And he said, well, are you troubled? Not anymore. But you know, those are things you make when you're inexperienced and don't understand how the appellate rules apply. And I have not found any case where I disagreed with the court on anything but an intellectual basis since then. And I don't feel badly about that. I don't think injustice was done. It's just opinions are like noses. Nearly everybody's got one. And I had mine, and it didn't always go with the majority.
Well, one final question for you. As you look back over your years of experience and the different interactions that you've had with not just the justices, but colleagues, those who are in different offices in the court, what is your best, favorite memory of all of that?
Gracious. All right.
Now this is, I'm going to warn you, this is a two-part question.
That's fine. I'll answer the second part first. One of the most important, pleasant memories I have of this place, and I expect to carry with me until I don't remember anything, is that in my interactions with all the sections of this court, administrative, secretarial, finance, everything, and everybody in OES, the clerks for justices, the people in the clerk's office. I never met anybody who was going to be ugly to me. I met people who were nice, who thought this is important, who did it as well as they knew how. And if I asked them for something, they never said, well, what do you want that for? It was, I'll get it if I can. And that's been consistent over that entire time. And I think it is a real compliment, not only to those people, but to the heads of various departments who recruited them. We, I think, are all on the same page and feeling that this is important and worth doing as well as possible. One moment. Governor Harrison had a son, Sid, and Sid used to like to build airplanes and fly them. And one day, he had borrowed an airplane from a person who had built it, was testing it out to see whether he might like to buy it, and it crashed, and it killed him. And I read about it, and I was awful sad for the governor, because I knew he loved his son, and I knew he would be very upset, and I knew his wife, Lacey Virginia, which I think is a pretty fitting name. What a gentle lady she was. I knew they would be upset. I also knew that as former governor, there were going to be a billion people there. It was all going to be down in his home, Saddle Tree Farm, which is a wonderful place, and in the town of Lawrenceville, which is very small. And I really didn't have any thoughts about going to it. just because there were just too many people. After a while, we Indians learn there are times when we can stick to what we're doing and let the important folks do what they need to do. And I got a call from Justice Carrico, then Chief Justice Carrico's secretary, Kathy Listander, another wonderful person. Justice Carrico wants to see you for a minute. Can you come over? Yeah, certainly. And I got in there, and there wasn't anything I was working on that I thought he would ask me a question about. So I said, what can I do for you, Justice Carrico? And he said, well, I know that you and Albertus are friends, and I suspect you're not going to go to the funeral, and I wonder whether you'd like to ride with me and Henry, referring to Justice Henry Whiting. And I said, well, you know, I really would. And he said, well, why don't you ride with us? Well, it may seem a small thing to some people, but it meant I got to go to a funeral I felt I should go, but I'd been held back by my feeling that the work needed to be done. And here, you know, the top of the heap had called me and said, why don't you come with us? I was very flattered by that. I think it showed that he really knew what was going on, not just with me and not just with the justices, but he knew a lot about what was going on with everybody. And he was a kind man. And when he saw an opportunity to do something for people, he did it. Now, what was your second question?
How would you like your work, your commitment, to be remembered?
I could sum it up in these words. He did the best he knew how. That's it. It was important to me. I've been here, Lord knows, many more Saturdays and Sundays than I care to count. But that's what's driven me. And that is, I needed to do the best I can because it's important. And here, I was 25 years old when I started here as a law clerk. I didn't know any other 25-year-old people who were this close to the process, who the justices would listen to. And I thought, well, you have to do your best because they're dependent on you. So that's all I can say about it.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. I appreciate it very much.